Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us and tuning in. I've got the opportunity to sit down with Freedom Wallace, aka Andrew McRae of Junction City Wrestling. It's a pleasure. Andrew, how you doing today?
I'm all right, I suppose.
Sign of the time. So, I'm going to start things off with probably the question you're most tired of answering. Who or what are your wrestling inspirations?
My wrestling inspirations. Well, wait, hold on a second. Who are you again?
My name is Liam Crothers. I'm working with Junction City Wrestling as an internship from Ryerson University.
Who hired you?
Andrew McRae did. Really nice guy.
Okay, I got to call my lawyer. Wrestling inspirations. You're right. I have been asked that a million times, and my answer remains the same every time. My favorite wrestler of all time is Bret the Hitman Hart. There's a handful of others which left an impression on me as a kid. Roddy Piper. Obviously, I come to the ring in a kilt to the bagpipes. He has something to do with that. Mr. Perfect comes to mind. Love The Undertaker. Obviously, most of the wrestlers who made an impression on me are from times long ago.
And it's interesting. The first three guys that you mentioned there, Bret Hart, Roddy Piper, and Mr. Perfect, all wrestle a very technical style. What would you say it is about their personas or their wrestling style that you draw inspiration from?
I suppose it goes hand in hand with the time at which I started watching wrestling. So my earliest memories of wrestling go back to 1992. At that time, WWF's going through the steroid trials. They were making a move towards smaller, more technical wrestlers. And obviously, as an impressionable 5-year-old, if WWF is telling me that Bret the Hitman Hart is the best wrestler in the world, then that's whose style is going to resonate with me the most. Obviously, I'm not a big guy. I'm 5'8", 160 odd pounds soaking wet. So, one of my advantages might be my speed and my ability to move around the ring versus some of the larger guys. So somebody like Hulk Hogan and Andre the Giant and all those characters from just before the early 90s, I kind of missed that time period. So they didn't have the same impression on me. So it's just kind of what I was born into and what I grew up watching.
So the bonsai drop isn't in the arsenal?
I was not a fan of Yokozuna. I remember one Saturday morning when he bonsai dropped Hacksaw Jim Duggan and they had blood coming out of the mouth of Duggan laying on the mat on Superstars. And that was a traumatizing experience for me.
And we mentioned the style just briefly. What would you say your wrestling style is?
Legitimate.
Could you expand on that at all?
So in ring, I'm a wrestling product of Battle Arts Academy, which is a school in Mississauga, Ontario. Opened in 2013, opened by Santino Marella, Anthony Corelli. And despite Santino being a rather comical character on television, Anthony has a legitimate martial arts background and initially had brought over a coach from Japan also with a legitimate martial arts background. And much to most of our surprise, when we walked in the door, we were presented with the idea that, you may have come here to be a professional wrestler. Probably none of you know what it really means or what it takes to be a professional wrestler. And then we were basically made to do martial arts classes in order to progress as a pro wrestler. So in training there for as many years as I did, I think I learned a lot of legitimate wrestling technique that I make use of in the ring.
Now, I know that at one point you were a blue belt in Judo. Do you find any parallels between that martial art and the art of professional wrestling?
It's not at one point. I am a blue belt in Judo. Yeah, there is absolutely parallels. I think that in order to be a successful professional wrestler, you need to have experience as an amateur wrestler before you can become a professional, as the name would imply. In terms of judo specifically, I was able to take judo techniques and throws that I learned and use them in professional wrestling matches. And I think that set me apart from some of the other wrestlers. I think a lot of wrestlers around the world learn somewhat the same style. Everybody kind of does a lot of the same stuff. So when you can throw something new into the mix, obviously there's examples out there, Ronda Rousey and Brock Lesnar coming from UFC backgrounds. Ronda Rousey specifically being on TV wearing a judo gi and using judo techniques, but yeah, there's an absolute parallel. So despite the theatrics, you need to have legitimate athletic martial arts training in order to be successful.
You mentioned you're not the biggest, not the strongest, self-admitted, but judo is the art of using your opponent's weight against them. So it's really, really interesting to see the way that you are able to implement that in the wrestling ring when, there are some guys who are 6'3", 240 pounds. They've got you by a bit, but you're able to use that to your advantage. I mean, working with Junction City Wrestling, you've had the opportunity to wrestle in a lot of historic venues in the Junction itself. What's that experience been like for you?
Quite honestly, it's been an honor and a privilege to have the opportunity to wrestle in some of the buildings that we've had shows in. Even from the time before I began wrestling, I had wanted to put on events in the Junction. And our upcoming event, March 27th at 3030 Dundas West, tickets available at junctioncitywrestling.com/tickets. That venue specifically, I had gone to and scouted out prior to wrestling and had talked to them about getting a ring in there and putting on a professional wrestling show. But I always knew that I wanted to actually be in the shows and wrestle. So obviously that takes time, which goes back to the kind of training and the amount of training that you need to do to actually be good at this and able to do it. So flash forward, 6 years after that initial conversation with 3030, we had our first event there in June of 2019, and here we are in 2022, and we're returning there. So there's 3030. Also, obviously, there's the Destructor on Symes Road, in which Junction Craft Brewery now resides. And our initial shows were in a parking lot outside next door to that building, which is referred to as the Destructor. So that was always looming in the background of those first episodes of Junction City Wrestling. And so it was a fitting and natural progression for us to graduate from doing free events in the parking lot to being able to actually put on ticketed events within that building. So there's a little bit of foreshadowing within those episodes that I wasn't even really aware of at the time.
Do you find that there's an elevated pressure when it comes to wrestling a free show in what is essentially a parking lot to wrestling in a venue where you're selling tickets, you're trying to bring people into the door, paying customers? Do you find that there's an elevated pressure on not just you, but the other workers as well?
I think there's a ever-evolving elevated pressure. I think there's always pressure. If you become too comfortable, you're not doing it right. You should always have that pressure of, okay, this next show that we're doing, this is the biggest deal. This is the biggest show that we've ever done. And I think I felt that way leading up to those first shows in the parking lot, just wanting to execute, wanting to make sure everything went off without a hitch, wanting to make sure everybody loved it, and also more so wanting to be able to do it again, and have the people who helped and supported me and basically allowed me to do it, allow me to do it again. So yeah, there's always an elevated pressure. So coming out of the parking lot into Junction Craft Brewery, 100% there was elevated pressure then. And even now, just from there being such a long wait for us to be able to do indoor shows again, even though I've done this countless times now, there's an elevated pressure for this show now as well. And with every organization and every group coming back at the same time, there are a lot of shows coming up in March and April. And it's a great time to be a fan, but I can't help but feel a little bit competitive in terms of wanting to put on the best show of the bunch for the fans. So there's an elevated pressure, absolutely, coming back indoors inside 3030 and for me, this is a big deal. This is it's Junction City Wrestling, Space Odyssey, but to use a cliche, this is our WrestleMania.
And you mentioned briefly the people behind the scenes that make that happen. There are people in front of the scenes, so to speak, that allow you to be successful in the professional wrestling ring, namely your cousin, Bradford Montague. What do you and your cousin hope to accomplish in Junction City Wrestling?
In Junction City Wrestling, what do my cousin and I hope to accomplish? Well, we have accomplished everything we've set out to do so far. We haven't actually had a tag team match together in 18 months. I think the last time we actually teamed was September of 2020. The last time we actually teamed in Junction City Wrestling would have been October of 2019. The January 2020 show, the Destructor Rumble inside Junction Craft Brewery, there was a tournament that took place, and Bradford Montague, my cousin, became one of two contenders who were supposed to compete for the first ever Junction City Wrestling Classic Championship. So Bradford, long story short, he's actually been back in Montague, Prince Edward Island. They named the town after him. And he wasn't able to be at the September 2021 Fandemic event. So he actually handed off the right to compete for the Classic Championship to me. And long story short, I don't have the belt. I don't really want to talk about what happened. But at some point, Bradford Montague is still entitled to a Classic Championship match. So I suppose, much like any other professional wrestler, our goal would be to achieve success through championships and recognition, and basically just, not be made to look silly at any point. Not that we ever have.
Well, building on that a little bit, Freedom, why is it you think that the fans at Junction City Wrestling tend to boo you?
The fans don't boo me.
I've heard some conflicting reports, and I've found that there are fans that aren't really, putting you on the Mount Rushmore when it comes to the competitors at Junction City Wrestling. Why do you think that is?
Well, those fans who boo me, as you say, I think they're just misinformed, misguided, misdirected, possibly miserable with their own lives, and just aren't paying close enough attention to what's really going on.
And, the fans are one thing, but the competitors are another. And it's no secret in professional wrestling, there are rivalries. Who is it you think that you dislike most in Junction City Wrestling?
I don't really like anybody in Junction City Wrestling, aside from Bradford.
And why is that?
I could go on for hours. When you say most, it depends on what day of the week it is, and it changes day by day, but specifically, I definitely don't like Space Monkey. Frank the Tank bothers me. Don't like Carew. Don't like Jody Threat. I could really go on and on. It's not worth our time.
And you mentioned some fan favorites, so maybe there is something to why the fans at Junction City tend to boo you. Now, how would you describe Junction City Wrestling to someone that is not really a wrestling fan? What kind of entertainment does Junction City bring?
Well, obviously our tagline is classic entertainment, and that could mean a lot of things. But I tell people often that you don't have to be a wrestling fan to have a good time at Junction City Wrestling and enjoy it. And in fact, I would rather appeal to non-wrestling fans because that allows us to grow the audience. But I don't think we need to differentiate necessarily between wrestling fan and non-wrestling fan. It's more of an experience for everyone to enjoy. Wrestling fans might be more familiar with what they're seeing, but it doesn't mean that they're going to have any better a time or a better experience than someone who's never watched wrestling will. So there are elements that wrestling fans will recognize, moves, techniques, so on and so forth, maybe even the way in which characters interact and the overall presentation. But if you've never been to a wrestling show before, you're just as likely to enjoy the show. So I tell them, Don't come in. Don't think you need to be a wrestling fan in order to have fun and enjoy it.
People don't need to be wrestling fans to enjoy the entertainment, but you yourself are a wrestling fan, so we're going to take a second here and get into a couple of hypotheticals. If you had a dream singles match with a wrestler that has since retired, who would that be with and why?
I suppose I'd have to say Bret the Hitman Hart. It seems like a silly thing to even hypothesize over, and thinking about what that would actually be like. However, wrestling's is a strange universe, and you never know who you're going to cross paths with in professional wrestling. And even in my experience, like, all kinds of characters from wrestling past have surfaced and shown up at events where I've been and had in-ring matches with other competitors. Not so much myself. I've wrestled Santino Marella, of course, but but I've been to events where, Ricky the Dragon Steamboat's been there, and Honky Tonk Man, and people have been lucky enough to have the opportunity to share the ring with those people. But my answer to your question is, if I was going to pick one from wrestling past, anywhere of all time in all of wrestling, I would say Bret the Hitman Hart. Why not?
And to build on that a little bit, you mentioned that there are people that have since retired that you've crossed paths with, but there are still active competitors that you've had the chance to interact with. I mean, most notably, at the time he was Buddy Murphy, and now he's Buddy Matthews in All Elite Wrestling. And I mean, that match didn't necessarily pan out for you. It was a pretty quick match, actually. I think I could watch it in a couple minutes. But is there a current professional wrestler that you've yet to step in the ring with that you would like the chance to get to at some point?
WWE edited that match down for TV, so it was actually a lot. I was in there a lot longer than it may have seemed. It was far more competitive than it was presented as. But I digress. In being there that day and wrestling Buddy Murphy, Buddy Matthews on WWE 205 Live, I knew there was going to be an opportunity to have a match on TV that night. And at the time, I wanted them to put me against a different 205 Live wrestler. So there's a ton of wrestlers out there that I'd like to compete against, but that other wrestler that day was Drew Gulak. I'd like to have a match with Drew Gulak.
I think Gulak's a tremendous technician. I mean, and again, we circle back to that technical style. He's a hard hitter, and he's got a lot of real techniques that he's able to implement in the ring. And personally, I would like to see that match. I can't say that I would put any money on you, but I would like to see that match nonetheless. Now,
you're not old enough to gamble anyway.
You had mentioned you'd tagged with Bradford Montague a couple months ago. Now at this point, haven't had that opportunity to do so pretty recently. But when it comes to dream tag team matches, is there a tag team that you wish you could get the opportunity to go against with Bradford by your side, or maybe with someone else by your side?
Well, I don't think I would ever have anyone else by my side, because it's family first always. For Bradford and I, dream tag team match, that's a tough one. I suppose dream tag team match, we'd be going back to even my childhood or before. I'm going to just throw out the British Bulldogs. I feel like we'd be a competitive match for Davey Boy Smith and the Dynamite Kid. I at one time wrestled Harry Smith, Davey Boy's son, and really took it to him, of course. Just came up just shy in that match.
Mm-hmm. I'm sure.
Yeah. So dream British Bulldogs. And I couldn't help, when you say dream, I can't help but think of the Dream Team, but we'll go with British Bulldogs. I think of that WrestleMania 2 Tag Team Championship match with Brutus Beefcake and Greg the Hammer Valentine against the British Bulldogs. There's actually a tie. Brutus Beefcake actually is partly responsible for Junction City Wrestling's inception. And I will veer off course for a second since he's just come up.
By all means.
But in first presenting the idea of having a Junction City Wrestling show to a local brewery, Shacklands Brewing Co. to be exact. I was in there chatting with Dave, who's been a massive support of Junction City Wrestling from the get-go, and we wouldn't exist without him or Shacklands. And within Shacklands, there's a wall behind the bar, and it's the shelf of everything, and it's full of memorabilia, knickknacks, so on and so forth. And on that shelf, there is a Brutus the Barber Beefcake collector cup. And before I pitched the idea of having a wrestling show, I spotted that glass, and that was my segue to start the conversation. I said, I see you have a Brutus the Barber Beefcake collector glass on your shelf of everything. Have you ever thought of having a professional wrestling show in the parking lot? And of course he said yes, and the rest is history. So thank you, Brutus the Barber Beefcake. And he's another, just to give you an idea of sort of the in-between awkward time of professional wrestling that I was born into. Like, I loved Brutus the Barber Beefcake, but it was that period of time where he came back and had the mask because he had been in the, I believe, a sailing accident or a parasailing accident. And I remember watching that ill-fated WrestleMania 9 live and in person, and being utterly confused when Hulk Hogan came out at the end of the show to win the championship from Yokozuna.
Yep, little strange, but
yeah. So which maybe, you know, I'm a product of 1992, 1993, and which maybe explains a lot.
Freedom, what is the most difficult thing about becoming a professional wrestler that you weren't privy to before you began your journey?
It's definitely the training and the physicality and the amount of dedication, and to use, like, it's not a cliche, it's sacrifice and discipline required. And obviously I knew it wasn't going to be a walk in the park, but to actually achieve a measure of success and get noticed, you need to be more than 100% committed. You have to practice every aspect of the craft every day. And you also have to be as physically fit as you possibly can be. So however it is that you want to achieve that fitness, there's a lot of different ways to do it. And I'm not saying, you know, you got to be hitting the weights 6 days a week and heavy bodybuilding, because there's lots of ways to be fit and in the best shape of your life. But there's definitely a big difference between being in good shape or even good enough shape and being in ring shape. You can run around the block as many times as you want and do as much cardio as you can possibly handle, but nothing compares to actually being in a wrestling match. It's its own style of cardiovascular fitness and conditioning. So I would say the hardest part about becoming a wrestler and being a wrestler is maintaining the level of fitness that you need to be at, and exercising the amount of discipline that you need to in order to actually maintain being at a top level, because it's the most competitive experience I've ever thrown myself into. And it took a long time to be granted the opportunities that I was granted, and it was because I was pushing past any limit I could have even imagined I had. Like, the limits I thought I had, no, I was wrong. Like, they were actually up here, and I needed to get well beyond those to even get the momentary opportunities that I had. My far longer than 90-second match with Buddy Murphy. That only ever happened because I pushed myself way beyond what I thought I was capable of doing. So yeah, it's the physical training that's required. And then just as number 2 on that list is navigating all the different personalities and finding ways to create the relationships that you need to create in order to be given the opportunities. And in some cases, you have to create the opportunities for yourself. So that doesn't even necessarily just apply to making a connection with a promoter who's going to give you an opportunity. But even in my case, if I want to, say, have a professional wrestling event inside a brewery, well, how is it that I'm going to meet the right person and have the right conversation in order to make that happen? So that would be number 2 beyond being as fit as you possibly can, pushing yourself past the limits you thought you had, and then navigating all the different personalities and just being a good communicator and being good at creating connections and building relationships.
You go back to that first point about the physical fitness. With hard work comes success. Freedom, what would you say has been the most joyous moment, the happiest moment of your career to this point?
There's a handful, and it's hard to pick which is the happiest. And I think they change over time, because what certain moments that I thought were meaningful or, put a certain weight to, say 2 or 3 years ago, now in hindsight, those aren't necessarily the moments I would pick. So I think as I change and mature and evolve and my thought process change and I transform my relationship with professional wrestling and the people within it, those moments change with those transformations. So it was still important to me to win the Battle Arts Light Heavyweight Championship for the first time back in 2018. But to be perfectly honest, that was more of a case of just being acknowledged as having worked as hard as I felt that I was. And that, it's like the elevated pressure that you place on having a event. Whereas, sure, I felt pressure putting on a show in a parking lot, and then I felt just as much or more pressure escalating to the brewery, and now I feel elevated pressure putting on this upcoming event inside 3030. And so, sometimes those moments which you may have thought were the greatest moments of your lives lose their luster over time because, once you get what you want and you don't want it anymore, you want the next accomplishment. So it's hard to say. I mean, I'm proud of having created Junction City Wrestling and having brought it to this point where now we're coming up on being 5 years old, and there's that old saying of starting up a business and it takes 5 years for you to get anywhere. So there's been a lot of happy moments. I'd say, I can specifically remember instances of being backstage and, worrying whether or not enough people were going to show up to an event. And then when it's bell time and the ring announcer hits the ring to intro everybody and I peek out and I see that the place is full, there are specific proud moments there that stand out. And then, of course, having the opportunity to wrestle in WWE and just knowing that happened. So even though it, went the way that it did in a losing effort against Buddy Murphy, just being able to say to myself now at 35 years old and knowing that if I could have told 5-year-old me that 30 years from now, I'd be able to say I wrestled in the WWE, that will forever be a proud, happy moment. So I know I go on and on about that, but I can't pinpoint moments. I just love wrestling in general. So there's constantly new happy moments that keep coming, and the way in which I feel about those moments changes over time. So it's hard to say a single happy moment. I just love doing this and hope that there will be many more happy moments to come.
And you'd mentioned briefly that, your plan for the first 5 years as Junction City Wrestling approaches its 5th birthday. What do you think is the scope for Junction City Wrestling in the next 5 years?
I'd like for it to continue growing. I mean, I don't know that I suppose when we started, I somewhat had a vague vision that this would be where we wound up, but it's evolving every year. I'm constantly trying to improve the presentation and the production value. I'm learning new skills as I go, not only in the ring, but from a production standpoint. And just, we're in a constant state of improvement, at least in my mind. So considering the dramatic evolution that we've gone through from our first event in July of 2017 to where we are now and what we're about to present on March 27th, I would hope that we undergo a similar period of growth and transformation over the next 5 years. So when we look back on March 27th, 2022, in 2027, we'll be able to compare it to, what it was like wrestling in the parking lot in 2017. And I hope there'll be a dramatic difference. I hope that we're selling exponentially more tickets than we are now. I hope, we can get up into venues that'll hold, quadruple digits number of people. And I'd like to explore what other historic venue spaces there might be, whether there's, theaters or wherever that might be. But I'd like it to grow within Toronto, find new places to put on shows, and perhaps even outside of Toronto. We've ventured out of the city a couple times in the past, and the Junction is not the limit for Junction City Wrestling. We can go anywhere.
Now that's the long term. We're going to bring it back in and talk about short term. What does the future hold for Clan Freedom March 27th at 3030 Dundas West?
I don't even know. We're just hoping Bradford makes his flight from Montague, Prince Edward Island. And at the moment, to the best of my knowledge, we are slated for tag team action. I haven't had the chance to talk at length to Bradford yet. I'm sure that he will eventually want his well-earned Classic Championship opportunity. But considering that we haven't had a tag team match in such a long time, I think it'll be fun for us to get back in there. And if there's any willing challengers, I don't know of any other tag teams in Junction City Wrestling at the moment. I know Long Slice Security, they were basically the only two, and they just split up. So it won't be against John Gonzalez and Matt Black. I know that much. And I don't really know who else may dare to challenge us. So, I mean, I didn't know that we had hired you as an intern, or I forgot, I guess.
Well, no matter what happens, I'm sure it'll be classic entertainment. March 27th at 3030 Dundas West. You can get your tickets now at junctioncitywrestling.com/tickets. My name is Liam Crothers. This has been a sit down with Freedom Wallace, a.k.a. Andrew McRae. Freedom, thank you for your time.
You're welcome.